In this lesson, we'll take a look at constants, which are values that cannot change while the macro is running. So far, we've been exposed to variables, and variables, as we know, can actually have their values changed throughout the process of a procedure. We haven't seen too many examples of this, but I assure you later on in the course, when we start diving into things like iteration, which means going through rows one at a time, variables will come into play a lot because we're going to be taking, for example, cell values and consistently reassigning them to a variable. Row 1 to a variable, then row 2 to a variable, then row 3 to a variable, etc. So variables, as the name suggests, can vary. They can change. Sometimes, however, in a program, you're going to need to store a number, for example, or a string or something that is constant, that is unchanging. For example, you may have a tax rate in an accounting spreadsheet, and that tax rate is going to stay constant for the entire duration of the procedure. In those cases, you can use something called a constant, and as the name suggests, a constant is simply a different type of variable, you can say, even though it can't vary, but it's a different way that we can assign a value to a given name in our program, but that value cannot change. Once we assign a value to a name, it is there for the entire duration of the macro's execution. So let's take a look at an example in my Visual Basic editor. I'm going to define a new procedure called fun with constants. And as we know by now, if we wanted to declare some kind of variable, we would simply use the dim keyword. Well, in order to declare a constant, we simply swap the dim keyword with the const keyword, C-O-N-S-T. So C-O-N-S-T. So one example of a constant that I can think of is pi in mathematics, which is 3.14159. That value is unchanging. So if we're going to have a variable called pi, there's really no reason to ever reassign anything besides an initial value to it. So I can do something like const pi, and let's say I'm going to make it a double, a floating point number. And one of the other things that's interesting about constants is whenever we declare them, we can actually make the declaration and the value assignment on the same line. We can't do that with regular variables. So instead of simply writing pi equals on the next line, I can put an equal sign right after that declaration and give it its initial value, like 3.14159. And this sort of makes sense because the reason we can assign a value is because a constant's value never changes. It just needs a basic starting point, and that's never going to change. So we can simply assign it wherever we declare the constant in the first place. Now, there are some conventions when it comes to naming constants, and it depends on what developer you talk to. Some people prefer to put all of their constant names in uppercase. Some people prefer to prefix their constants with a lowercase letter c, C for constant. So as an example, let's say I want to have a constant that represents the total number of months in a year. I can have something like const, let's say C months, and that will be, let's say, a long or a whole number, and I can assign it to 12. And as I mentioned earlier, maybe I'll have something like a tax rate that's going to be used throughout the procedure many times, and I can declare it in a constant just for easy reference. So I can do const something like C tax rate as a double, and maybe our arbitrary tax rate is, I don't know, 0.0825. And these constants now are unchangeable. So if we try to accidentally give them a brand new value, VBA is going to throw an error. For example, if I later on in the procedure say, okay, well now my tax rate is going to be something different like, I don't know, 10. And as soon as I execute this, we're going to run into an error right here when VBA is going to say compile error, assignment to constant not permitted. So it's a constant. You can't assign anything new to it. What is originally assigned must stay constant. It must stay the same. Let's go ahead and quit our debug mode by clicking the blue reset button at the top right here. And the last thing I want to show you in this lesson is the familiar protocol that we can use to make a constant available to all procedures in a module, as well as available across the entire collection of modules in a workbook. So as we talked about a little bit earlier, if we declare something outside of a procedure in a module, it will be available as a module scope. So it can be accessed by any of the actual procedures in that module. And if I do something like that here, for example, I want to have a string, and I'm going to call that string job title. The interesting thing here is that if I do this outside of a procedure, I can actually assign the initial constant value outside of the procedure. So I can do something like VBA developer. This is not possible with a basic variable, which requires us to actually assign that value in the body of a procedure. However, a constant needs something to begin with because it's unchanging, it's kind of everlasting. So we can assign that outside of any procedure. And now if I want to use this not global, but module level constant, if I have a procedure here, for example, occupation, I can actually reference it from within. So I can do something like, let's do debug print, and write something like I am a, and let's concatenate job title. And even though job title is not declared with an occupation, it's going to have access to it because it's available on the module level. So when I execute occupation, we're going to get I am a VBA developer. In order to make a constant available across all of the modules in your workbook, and again, a sample case for this may be something like a tax rate for an accounting application that is going to stay constant. What you can do is just simply declare that tax rate once as a globally available constant, and it's going to be available in all procedures, and you don't have to keep reassigning it over and over. The way you declare it so that's available across the entire collection of modules in a workbook is simply by prefixing this const with the keyword public. We ran into this a couple lessons ago. It's pretty similar. Public simply means publicly available, available everywhere. So if I now go ahead and take my occupation procedure, I'm going to cut it, and I'm going to create a brand new module here, module 2, insert module. I'm going to put it right here. Even though job title is defined in module 1, it's still going to be available here because it is publicly available. It's globally available. So when I execute this, we're going to still get I am a VBA developer. And you can imagine here, again, if we're doing some kind of worksheet calculation with a number that we need that is consistent, or some kind of string we need that's consistent, or some kind of Boolean setting that we need, we can just simply declare those as a globally available constants and have access to them in whatever module we need. That's all there's to cover in this lesson. We talked about the idea of constants. Those are declared with the const keyword, C-O-N-S-T. You can assign it an initial value, but you cannot assign it a secondary value. That's why it's a constant. Its value cannot change. It remains static and unchanging. You can simply limit a constant to the body of a procedure, that is module level. You can also, procedure level, or local scope. You can also allow it to be used by any procedure in a module. You simply have to declare it outside of a procedure, and you can, of course, make it globally available as well by prefixing it with the public keyword.